Hey everyone, welcome back. You know how much we all value efficiency, right? Getting the most knowledge in the shortest amount of time. Well, today we're diving into a story, a really ancient one, that packs a lot of wisdom into a pretty compact package. We're talking about Prophet Hud, peace be upon him.
And his people, or.
Orad, yeah.
Mm.
We got a ton of requests to explore this topic, especially after that lecture by Dr. Othman
It's a
Alchemist.
great one to break down for sure.
Right. And what's really fascinating is that this story, according to Hadith, is about the very first Arab messenger. Like, think about that.
First one sent to the Arabs.
The very first. So his interactions with his people, his community, his food offer some incredible insights into, just basic human nature, like what we're made of, how we react to things, and what happens when we make certain choices. Our mission today is to really boil this whole ancient narrative down to its essence. We're not going to get lost in the weeds. You're going to walk away understanding the core message, why it matters, and how it applies to us even today. Ready to jump in?
Let's do it.
So, where do we even begin with Hud and Ed? Like, what's the starting point for this whole story?
Well, I think a good place to start is with Hud's lineage, where he came from. Dr. Alchemist points out that although genealogists have some differences in the details, they pretty much all agree that Hud can be traced back to Sam. Sam, the son of Prophet Noah, peace be upon them both.
Yeah.
So we're talking way, way back.
Yeah.
After the Great Flood, that kind of time frame.
Wow, that puts things into perspective. And it's interesting, Hud himself is mentioned 7 times in the Quran. But his tribe, Ahad, they're mentioned 27 times.
That's a lot.
That's a lot. It's like boom, 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 Ahad, Ahad, Ed. You can't miss them, right? That repetition, it really highlights their importance in the Islamic tradition.
For sure. And geographically speaking, they were located in a region called Al-Aqaf. It means sandy mountains in Yemen.
Okay.
And the lecture even gets specific, saying they were probably somewhere between Oman and Hadramaut in a place called Al-Shir. And what's really cool is that Al-Shir still exists today, and it's still known for its agriculture. So, it's not just some mythical place. It grounds the story in a real, tangible location.
It makes it feel, I don't know, more relatable, less like a fairy tale, like a real chapter in human history, you know what I mean?
Absolutely.
Now, Dr. Alchemist goes on to categorize the Arabs, and he puts Ahad in this category called Arab Ariba Ba'ida, the ancient vanished Arabs. What's the significance of that classification?
Basically, think of it like this. You've got these different Arab groups. The Arab Ariba are like the OG Arabs. They're ancient, and they've completely disappeared over time.
Vanished.
Gone. Then you have the Arab Bakia. These are the remaining Arabs. Think of like the tribes that trace their lineage back to Qatan.
Okay.
And then you have the Arab Mustariba. These are the Arabized Arabs, the descendants of Ishmael. And it's worth mentioning, a lot of other ancient tribes that you might have heard of, like Thumud, the Ararpu, Prophet Salih, Tazim, Jadis, they all fall under that vanished category.
So Alad is like this ancient, lost civilization.
That's a good way to put it.
And what was their society like? The transcript mentions these tents with massive pillars. It seems like a contradiction, right? Tents, but with huge pillars.
Yeah, it's a striking image, and it comes straight from the Quran. There's a verse that describes their dwellings as having these lofty pillars, the likes of which had not been created in the lands. So you've got these tents, which are usually temporary structures.
Right.
But then you've got these enormous pillars, hinting at incredible strength and maybe even advanced building techniques. It definitely paints a picture of a powerful civilization. And, we'll see how that power might have actually contributed to their downfall.
Foreshadowing. Now, the lecture also talks about Alad and Aratas. How do we distinguish between these two?
So the Ad Prophet Hud, the ones we're focusing on today, are considered to be the first Ad. They're often called Ad Iram, going back to that Quranic description of the massive pillars. The second Ad, it's not really clear who they are. Some scholars say they were Thumud, Prophet Salih's people.
Right.
Others say they might have been from Saba, descended from Qatan. But for our purposes, the key point is that the Ad we're talking about, the ones who rejected Hud, they were the original Ad, the first ones.
At Edom. Got it. What about their spiritual beliefs? It's mentioned they were the first to start worshiping idols after the Great Flood, back in Noah's time.
Yeah, and that's a really crucial detail. After the flood, which basically wiped out widespread disbelief, humanity eventually fell back into old patterns. And the transcript says that at Ad, they were the first among Noah's descendants to revert to idol worship.
Wow.
Their main idols were Sada, Samad, and Hara. Sometimes you'll see the third one as Haba. But the point is, they completely abandoned the monotheism that Noah had preached.
So 3 specific idols with names and everything. It's kind of depressing, right? To think
Yeah,
about how quickly they went back to polytheism.
it is.
Now, in terms of the timeline, where do Hud and Ad fit in after Noah? We know they came after, but how much time passed? Like, were they immediate successors?
Well, in the Quran, Hud reminds his people, and remember when he made you successors after the people of Noah? So that pretty clearly puts them in the generation right after the flood.
Okay.
There's actually some debate among scholars about whether there were other prophets between Noah and Hud, but Dr. Alchemies seems to suggest that maybe there weren't.
Interesting.
And that's significant, right? Because it means Ad had a very recent, very clear example of what happens when you disobey God's messengers.
A front row seat to the consequences.
Exactly.
All right, so we've got their lineage, their location, this picture of a powerful but spiritually lost ancient civilization. Now let's get to the heart of it. What was Hud's message? What was his actual call, his EA to his people?
Well, like all the prophets sent by God, Hud's central message was the oneness of God, worshiping Allah alone. No partners, no idols. That's the foundation of Islam, of monotheism, really. And it's a message that's been repeated throughout history.
So a pretty straightforward message, one God. How did that go over with Ut, this powerful, seemingly advanced civilization? What was their reaction?
Oh, not well. Not well at all. In fact, their initial reactions were very negative, mirroring the resistance that many prophets faced.
Oh, really?
Yeah, they accused him of all sorts of things. Oh, ugget, which basically means foolishness. They said he was a gunnis, a liar, that he was making stuff up, fabricating lies against Allah, which is a huge accusation in Islam. They even called him crazy,
Yeah.
saying he was suffering from EAHA. And, you know, the transcript actually links this to a verse in the Quran that talks about how past messengers were often labeled as sorcerers or madmen.
Yeah.
It's like this recurring pattern throughout history. When you challenge the status quo, the existing power structures, you get hit with these accusations. It's a way to discredit you, to make people afraid of you.
Classic smear campaign.
It's crazy how we humans just resist anything that challenges our comfortable worldview, even if those beliefs are based on, like, nothing.
Absolutely.
The lecture mentions another interesting accusation. They said Hud was somehow afflicted or cursed by their gods. What was the logic behind that?
Their goal was to scare him, basically, to make him think that by rejecting their idols, he'd angered these deities, and that's why he was acting so, foolish or crazy in their eyes. It was a way to discredit him, to pressure him into going back to their traditional beliefs.
So fear tactics.
Exactly. But the transcript highlights this beautiful contrast between their fear-mongering and Hud's response.
Which is total faith and trust in Allah. He wasn't fazed at all. And it actually touches on this idea that Satan is the one who instills fear in his followers. True believers, on the other hand, they find strength and courage in God.
It flips the script, right? It's not Hud who's afraid, it's them who are projecting their own fear. And Hud's response to their accusations is so powerful. Can you remind us what he said, that declaration that kind of sets the stage for the whole conflict?
Oh, absolutely. He said, and I'll translate it as I go, Safed, Ajos Gacha Cho.
He treats the right a temple with on his am heart. Bro from with it orin. Ooh, come on, he eyes. Blutch aid. Ait oviri, which means I call Allah to witness, and you all bear witness, that I am free from what you associate with him, meaning I'm innocent of your idol worship. He goes on, Hen on the ait, oi die John ait te ode jung. Basically, plot against me, all of you, and don't hold back. Like, bring it on. And then this incredible statement of faith.
I've relied upon Allah, my Lord and your Lord. And then he adds, which translates to, there is no creature but that he holds its forelock. That's a powerful image.
What does that mean, the forelock part? It sounds very, I don't know, almost violent.
It's actually a metaphor. Holding someone by their forelock, it means you have complete control over their movements.
Ah, I see.
So when Hud says Allah holds every creature by its forelock, he's emphasizing God's absolute power over all of creation. Nothing happens without his permission.
So it's not about violence, it's about ultimate control. And Hud is basically saying, look, I'm putting my trust in the one who's in control, not in your powerless idols.
Exactly.
Now, the transcript points out that Hud's declaration echoes a similar statement made by Prophet Noah. Can you talk about that connection?
Yeah, it's fascinating. Prophet Noah, when he was dealing with the same kind of rejection from his people, he said, Ich meine, Tiana, wait, Charles?
Or you check, you socially, your shy, your child, your child, your child. So one do it, you child, your kill your child. You child, your child, yeah, your child, your child. Okay, how are you? I appetite now. You child, you, and so depend on Allah. I've relied. So plot your plan, you and your idols, and don't hide your intentions. Then carry it out against me and don't delay. Both prophets, facing huge opposition, basically challenged their people to do their worst, showing their complete trust in God's protection. They're saying, my faith is my shield, what do you have?
Right.
The lecture even mentions Prophet Muhammad's courage during the Battle of Hunain. Why is that example relevant here?
Well, it shows that this unwavering reliance on Allah, especially when things get tough, is a defining characteristic of all prophets. It's not just Hud or Noah. It's a consistent theme.
It's like a thread that runs through all the prophetic stories. And it makes sense. If you're going to go up against an entire society, you need that kind of faith.
Oh, sure.
So Hud makes this powerful declaration, but Oyad still refuses to believe. How does Hud react to their continued disbelief?
He basically tells them, look, I've delivered the message. You can choose to ignore it, but Allah is perfectly capable of replacing you with another people who will listen. He says, Oid, and Oisoon, Ahathan, Ubisihuon, Uagio, Heyo, Usasaler, Ehusicho, Oticho, Iltanchu, Ei. Well, piece of favor.
Adar Hisnai. How are you Sophie here?
Oh, yeah. One of their main arguments was, we're just doing what our ancestors did. Why should we change? They said to Hud, their Sadeh job, a sod of the field, a osad, which means, have you come to us to make us worship Allah alone and abandon what our fathers worshipped? That blind adherence to tradition, even when it's clearly wrong, it's something we see a lot throughout history.
It's comfortable, right? Familiar,
Oh.
even if it's based on nothing.
Yeah. And they went even further. They flat out denied the idea of resurrection. It's like they couldn't grasp anything beyond this physical world.
So they were very materialistic in their outlook.
Yeah, they scoffed at the concept of an afterlife. They said, which means, does he promise you that after you die and become dust and bones, you'll be brought forth again? They basically said, that's ridiculous. And they continued, Chance, don't answer you all They say you I said sometime how he pissed step. Today, no, that you go 8A. It means far, far is that which you are promised. There's only this life. We die, we live, and we won't be resurrected.
A very limited worldview. And that limited perspective probably fed into their stubbornness, their complete dismissal of Hud's message.
Definitely. It reached a point where they just didn't care anymore. They were like, whatever, Hud, we've heard enough. This is all just stuff from the past. They said, it's any of the NTA. It makes no difference to us whether you preach or not. And then they added, board to or flande. Now, this part's interesting. This is just the way of the ancients. There are two ways to interpret that. Either they meant it as, this is how people have always lived and we're not changing. Or they meant it as, this is all just made up stuff from the past, like myths and legends.
So basically they're saying, we're not buying it.
Yeah. They finished with, AD said, AD Tadi, and Tuagaba, and we will be punished. Oh, like they were completely convinced they were untouchable.
It's wild, the level of denial. And they demanded a sign too, right? A tangible proof?
Yep. They were like, show us a miracle, Hud, then we'll believe you. They said, well, Conas. Isel late. Ishores is kimendrin in fulamia eyes, like Saya say. Eat odia isiak I. You haven't brought us any clear sign, and we're not abandoning our gods just because you say so. We don't believe you. But, Dr. Alchemies points out that this demand for a sign, it wasn't genuine. It was just another excuse to keep disbelieving.
So they weren't really looking for proof. It was just a way to shut him down.
Exactly. Because the Quran is very clear that God's messengers, the Hud, they always came with signs. And there's a hadith that says every prophet was given signs that would normally convince people. Now, we don't know exactly what signs Hud was given, but the point is he had them. And the Quran, it's not a history book. Its main purpose is guidance, not listing every single detail of every prophet's life.
Right. The Quran is about the big picture, the principles. So even though Ada was stubborn, demanding signs they didn't really want, how did Hud approach them? What was his method, his sotel, in delivering his message?
Well, the lecture emphasizes a few key points. First, he was incredibly gentle and patient. Despite their hostility, he kept addressing them as Julo, which means, "Oh, my people." It's a term of endearment. He didn't resort to anger or insults.
So kindness in the face of aggression.
Exactly. He was also incredibly sincere and trustworthy. He told them, meaning, "I'm delivering my Lord's messages to you, and I'm a sincere and trustworthy advisor." He wasn't trying to deceive them or gain anything for himself. He was genuinely concerned about
A
them.
genuine desire to help them.
Yeah. And he also reminded them of all the blessings Allah had given them, like, hey, remember how you inherited the earth after Noah's people? And look at your strength and size and all the livestock and children and gardens and springs you have. Allah has been so good to you.
Appealing to their sense of gratitude.
Exactly. And then he used both encouragement and warning. He encouraged them by saying, if you seek forgiveness, if you repent, Allah will send you rain, increase your strength, bless you even more. But he also warned them, saying, if you keep rejecting God, his wrath and anger will descend upon you.
So he offered them both hope and a very real consequence.
He did. And he directly challenged their idols, too. He said, look, these are just names you and your ancestors came up with. They have no power, they can't help you, and they can't harm you. Why are you worshiping them?
It seems like he tried everything. He appealed to their reason, their emotions, their sense of gratitude, their fear, but it wasn't enough.
Unfortunately not. They remained defiant, and that brings us to the consequences, the descent of punishment, increase.
This is the part that always gets me. They had every chance, and they just squandered it.
It's a tragic story. So they kept pushing Hud, saying, bring on the punishment then. If you're telling the truth, let's see it. They said, eat, Sayatano. Eat, die, here die. Bring us what you promise us if you should be of the truthful. And at that point, Hud had done everything he could, so he turned to Allah in prayer. He said, my Lord, support me against the disbelievers. And God answered his prayer. He did. Allah said, in a little while they will surely be regretful. And then the punishment came. It started with a terrifying blast, a udkez. The Quran describes it as be out the OK8, asiathari AP, so arrows that they want to get still on udk. H-show. Old eats age, it TC that it's saying off the old Kes. As EHA scene came from their Garp, or it describes it as a DAT. One quoted, how to the Mikroalit to? Eat Adroal to. Because the set out that eat rude aid, the eat two of the eat O2 dairy, meaning, so the blast overtook them by just decree, and we made them as uprooted stubble. Then away with the wrongdoing, people.
Uprooted stubble. That's a chilling blast.
It is. And it's important to note that before this final punishment, there was a severe drought.
A drought.
Yeah, for 3 years it didn't rain. It was a huge trial, a clear warning from Allah. But Atad remained stubborn. They didn't change their ways. And then finally they saw a cloud in the sky. And instead of seeing it as a sign of potential mercy, they got excited, thinking it was going to rain. They said, this is a cloud bringing us rain.
But it wasn't rain.
No, Allah revealed that the cloud was actually carrying their punishment. He said, no, did you say this is an Henshin ADF? Rather, it is that which you were impatient for, a wind containing painful punishment. It was a fierce, destructive wind that raged for 7 nights and 8 days.
7 nights and 8 days. Just imagine the terror. What happened to Akkad after that?
The Quran paints a very vivid picture. It says they became like hollowed-out palm tree trunks. And in another verse, like they'd been ripped out of the ground, leaving nothing behind. And then Allah asks, then do you see any remnant of them? The answer, of course, is no. They were utterly annihilated.
Completely gone. The lecture then brings up a side story about a delegation from Ad that went to Mecca to pray for rain. This was before the final destruction, right?
Right. This story, narrated by Ibn Ishaq, gives us a little more context about what led up to the punishment. So Odad is suffering from this drought, and they send a delegation to Mecca. Even back then, Mecca was considered a holy place, and people would go there to pray for relief.
Makes sense.
So this delegation, they stay with Muawiyah bin Bakr, who is a relative of Hud. But instead of focusing on prayer, they get distracted by worldly pleasures. They start enjoying themselves, forgetting about the hardship back home. And then there's this really poignant part where some slave girls recite poetry, reminding the delegation of their people's suffering.
So even in the face of hardship, they couldn't let go of their desires. And then there's that part about Quail ibn Ounce and the black cloud.
Ah, yes. This is a powerful episode. So Quail ibn Ounce, he was the leader of the delegation, and a voice from the heavens gives him a choice. 3 clouds, white, red, and black. He chooses the black cloud, thinking it'll bring the most rain.
Of course he does.
But the voice warns him, you've chosen ashes and destruction. It prophesies the annihilation of Ashad, except for those who believe in Hud.
So even what seemed like a positive sign, a rain cloud, was actually a sign of their doom.
Exactly. It shows how limited our human understanding can be, especially when we're disconnected from divine guidance.
And there's a detail about a woman being the first to witness the destructive wind.
Yeah, the transcript mentions that a woman from Adad saw the black cloud approaching, carrying this terrifying wind. It looked like fire, and she saw these menacing figures in it. She was absolutely terrified, and it really highlights the sheer horror of what was about to happen.
A truly apocalyptic scene. So what happened to Hud and his followers during all of this?
They were saved by Allah's mercy. The transcript says that Hud and the believers had separated themselves from the disbelievers. They were in a protected enclosure, a ishi. And while the wind destroyed everyone else, it passed over them gently without harming them. It's a clear example of divine protection for those who believe and obey God's messengers.
A stark contrast. The believers were saved and everyone else was.
Gone. The term used to describe Adad is ayich, which means utterly vanished, erased from existence. And to further emphasize that they were real, historical people, Dr. Alchemies mentions a hadith where Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, talks about the delegation of Aqaid as an example of people seeking relief from hardship. So their story is very much a part of Islamic tradition.
It's amazing how these different sources and stories all come together. Now, the wind that destroyed them is specifically described as Ainia, a barren wind. What's the significance of that description?
The word Ania means barren. So, unlike winds that bring rain and help plants grow, this wind brought nothing but death and destruction. It was a force of pure annihilation. No good came from it, only ruin.
So the fact that Hud and the believers were saved, that was entirely due to Allah's mercy.
Absolutely. Their faith and obedience were what protected them. Dr. Alchemies really drives home the point that Ahan's destruction was a direct result of their choices. They rejected Allah's signs, disobeyed his messenger, followed their own desires, and basically earned God's curse in this life and the next.
It's a sobering reminder that our actions have consequences.
They do.
And there's even a hadith where Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, talks about his own fear when there were strong winds. It connects back to A'ad and how they reacted to the cloud.
That's right. Aisha, may Allah be pleased with her, narrates that whenever there were strong winds, Prophet Muhammad would get really worried, remembering the story of A'ad and fearing a similar punishment. It shows that even natural phenomena can be powerful reminders of Allah's power and his ability to both punish and show mercy.
It bridges the gap between that ancient story and the lived experience of the early Muslims. And finally, we have the poetry of Marthad bin Sa'd ibn Nufair. He was a believer from Ad, and his poem really captures the tragedy of what happened.
Yeah, his poem is really moving. He talks about how thirsty his people were during the drought, how their delegation to Mecca failed to bring any release, how stubborn they were in their disbelief, and he affirms his own faith in Hud and in Allah. He even mentions the names of their idols, Sam, Sada, and Sesha, lamenting their powerlessness. It's a really powerful and emotional ending to the story of Adad's destruction.
It personalizes it, right? You see the impact on individuals, not just a civilization as a whole. So after this deep dive into the story of Hud and Adad, what are the main lessons we can take away?
There are so many. I think the most important one is the danger of arrogance. Ad was so proud of their strength and their achievements that they couldn't see the truth. They boasted, "Ooh, ooh, eep jar she door, see, who's stronger than us." And that arrogance led to their downfall.
Pride comes before the fall. A classic lesson.
Definitely. And we also see the importance of patience and gentleness in calling people to Islam. Hud never gave up on his people. He kept advising them kindly, even when they were hostile.
A good reminder that kindness can be more effective than force.
Absolutely. The story also reminds us that wind, like all natural forces, is ultimately controlled by Allah. He can use it for good or for punishment.
We often take the natural world for granted, but it's all part of God's plan.
That's right. And Hud's example shows us the importance of unwavering faith and courage. He never wavered in his belief, even when he was outnumbered and threatened.
True faith means standing up for what you believe in, even when it's hard.
Exactly. And the lecture also condemns building luxurious structures just for show, for bragging rights, unless it's out of necessity or a sincere expression of gratitude to Allah.
A reminder to check our intentions right, to make sure we're not just chasing worldly possessions.
Exactly. It's interesting to note that the story of Ahmed isn't mentioned in the Torah or the Gospel. Some scholars say this might be due to envy on the part of the children of Israel. It raises some interesting questions about how different faiths view each other and how history is recorded.
It's definitely food for thought.
And finally, the complete destruction of an Eid, it's a powerful reminder of what happens when you reject God's guidance and persist in disbelief. Their fate is a warning for all of us.
So to wrap this up, we've seen this incredible cycle play out. God sends a messenger, the people reject him out of arrogance and disbelief, and then they face the consequences. Hud and the believers were saved by Allah's mercy, but Aid was completely wiped out. This story, although it happened so long ago, still has so much to teach us today.
It does. It makes us think about the different forms arrogance can take in our lives. Are we too attached to our intellect, to our possessions? Are we holding on to beliefs that are outdated or harmful? And what are the signs that we might be ignoring? What messages from God are we missing because we're too busy, too distracted, or too stuck in our own ways?
Those are powerful questions to consider. Thank you for sharing your insights on this story. It's really given us a lot to think about. And to our listeners, we hope this deep dive has been enlightening and inspiring. Keep seeking knowledge, keep reflecting, and keep the story of Hud and Adad in mind as you navigate the complexities of life.
Jazakallahu khairan.
Until next time, peace.